Yeah. Okay. What were the fundamental problems faced by the British economy between the 1940s and the 1970s?
The fundamental problems that the British economy had after the war was that it adopted a socialist, welfarist approach to its problems. It created the welfare state. It raised taxes to very high rates. And there was, over the next 20 years, a tremendous growth in public expenditure, which undermined the potential dynamism of the British economy. If you compare the British economy's growth and general dynamism after the war with the same growth of Germany, you find a tremendous difference, and the same is true of productivity and all the measures you'd use to measure the dynamism of the economy. And the inflation problem really came from the efforts of the governments of the 70s to break out of that sluggish growth pattern. And of course, their efforts led to inflation. And we saw inflation as well as stagnation, so-called stagflation, in a major way by the end of the 70s. And that was the prelude to Mrs. Thatcher's coming into power, to basically, first of all, to right inflation. And it was hoped also to restore a free market.
Thank you. What is monetarism, and why does it come to be seen as a solution to inflationary problems in the late 1970s?
Well, before Mrs. Thatcher came into power, the socialist governments, or the corporatist conservative governments that were in power, thought the way to tackle inflation was to have an incomes policy, to control wages and prices directly. Now, that's both ineffective and it's very bad for free markets. It obviously is a denial of free markets and leads to great dislocations of the economy. So monetarism is actually an effective way to control inflation, because the underlying cause of inflation is the printing of money, which then leads to too much demand, bidding up the prices of goods, so inflation. So money is the underlying determinant of demand in the economy, and if you print too much of it, basically you get too much demand, and so inflation. So the Thatcher plan was to use monetarism as the fundamental way of controlling inflation. Now, apart from being effective in controlling inflation, monetarism also has the tremendous benefit that it frees markets. You don't have any of these damaging policies for markets, the incomes and price controls that cause so much damage to markets. So it took over from those basically useless policies that were also damaging for the operation of markets.
Thank you. What led you to become a proponent of a free market point of view in economics?
Well, there are two reasons for free markets, basically. One is that freedom is a sort of seamless web. You can't have freedom in the political sense without economic freedom. So there's a basic political reason for free markets, that it's necessary for freedom in general. And the second reason for free markets is that it creates incentives, which means that the capitalist system works well as compared with planning, which clearly fails. And the major reason it fails is because it destroys people's incentives. There's a third reason for free markets, which is that it not only creates incentives, it also is efficient in the use of information. Planning is inefficient in the use of information because the planner can't have in his head or in his computer the information that myriads and myriads of markets have in a decentralized way. And so that's another reason why free markets are better at creating wealth. So there's a political reason for it, and there is a couple of strong economic reasons for free markets.
Thank you. How would you assess the relative influences of the Austrian school, the Chicago school, and the school of public choice on contemporary economic thinking?
Well, then these different schools, the Austrian school, the Chicago school, and the public choice school of economics are really all different parts of free market thinking, really. Different research programs, if you like, in free market thought. The Chicago school has pioneered the use of statistics and mathematical economic theory in understanding the behavior of markets. It's a rather more technical part of free market thinking, and it's a lot of ingenious additions to theory and statistics that have improved our understanding of how markets work and supplied some useful numbers in some cases. Austrian theory is more philosophical, really. It's stressed the role of information and the philosophical case for free markets, and of course Hayek in particular explained how it was that free markets were good for the economy in a very fundamental way, and good for political freedom. And there are a lot of insights in Austrian economics, but the basic insight is that markets are a discovery process, accumulating information and spreading it in a decentralized way. And Austrian economists are rather hostile to the Chicago idea of using econometrics, as we call it, statistics and mathematical economic theory. They think that that's really rather perhaps pushing the limits of our techniques too far. But nevertheless, I mean, although they don't do that sort of thing themselves, the two schools of thought are perfectly complementary. Then the public choice is really, the public choice theory is another branch of theory which explores just what it is that makes public institutions run by bureaucrats behave the way they do. Again, it's not inconsistent with the other schools of thought. It's simply a different research program. It's focused on a different sort of aspect of economic life. Why bureaucracies behave the way they do, why governments behave the way they do, why vested interests push governments and voters push them in certain ways. And so it's really exploring that dimension, while the Chicago school explores what happens, what private agents do in markets, how private behavior hangs together, if you like, and the Austrians really supply the sort of philosophical underpinnings of the free market case.
Thank you. Why have free market economic ideas become influential in recent decades?
Well, I think there are two basic reasons why free market ideas have become influential recently. The first, of course, is that the link with political freedom has been understood. And in Eastern Europe, for example, they want freedom, and they see free markets as an indispensable part of freedom. You can't control your life as a citizen if you can't control what comes into your pocket and how you spend your money and your property and so forth. So that's the first reason, it's political. And the people who weren't free have embraced free markets because they wanted freedom. They also embrace free markets and because they work, for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. They work because they provide incentives, and also they are efficient users of information. They disseminate and use information efficiently, whereas planning systems are very inefficient use of information. So those reasons have become understood by people, and of course they, as often happens, people didn't reach these views theoretically or even philosophically. They reached it because they saw how awful the systems were under planning. And people in the West have seen how dreadful Eastern Europe was. The people of Eastern Europe have seen how dreadful it was. And of course, that is a wonderful way to convince people. Failure of a system is perhaps the most effective way to convince people that capitalism works. If they see how terrible planning is, and they realize that how wonderful capitalism is by contrast.
Thank you. In what ways were you involved with government policy in the 1980s in your capacity as an advisor to the Thatcher government?
Well, I'm an academic who is researching on money and the behaviour of the economy, and causes of unemployment, that sort of thing. So my research interests are in the behaviour of the economy, and I started to give advice to the Thatcher ministers and later, first of all, when they were in opposition in 1978, and then when they went into government, on how to carry out monetarist policies, and also on the issues of unemployment, and then issues of the welfare state as well later on, as they moved into thinking about health reform. And I did so as a professional economist who is doing work in those areas. And obviously, the Mrs. Thatcher's government drew on a lot of independent advice of people like me.
Thank you. What major changes in a free market direction were achieved in the British economy under the Thatcher government?
Well, the first big success of Mrs. Thatcher was bringing down inflation, which she did pretty sharply, bringing it down to really about 5% by the end of 1982, which, when you think that it reached nearly 20% in 1980 as a result of the breakdown of the wages policy of the previous government, is quite a remarkable improvement in a very short space of time. So that was the first success. The second big success was the reduction of trade union power, the reform of the trade unions, obviously culminating in the defeat of the coal miners' challenge to those reforms, and to the government's decision that trade unions wouldn't run the country. And then I think the next, after those two major battles with inflation and the unions, which Mrs. Thatcher undoubtedly won hands down after a pretty hard 5 years, then the next stage of reform was concerning the privatization of state industries, of course, a very big program, which started very small but got bigger and bigger as it became more and more clear how successful it was. And the associated programs of tendering out public services if they couldn't be privatized, deregulating such things like the stock exchange, similar type of program where there were government regulations which were cramping market competition and effective incentives. So that was the next phase, privatization and deregulation. Not all of that was immediately successful, but I think a lot of it was highly successful, and it was on a rolling program where they tried things out and learnt from their mistakes. And for example, the electricity privatization was a lot better than the privatization of British gas, which was privatized as a monopoly. So they learned from the mistake they made of privatizing British gas as a monopoly. So that was the next phase, the third phase, like privatization, deregulation. And then the final phase, which was only really starting to roll when Mrs. Thatcher left office was the welfare state reforms of health and education, opting out essentially, and what has to come after opting out, which is the beginnings of a market, a proper market in health and education. So the health and education reforms were really the first part of what has to be a much longer term program of getting the market in health and education to work properly, and I would say it's only half underway. And I think those are the four areas: inflation, trade union reform, privatization and deregulation, and the welfare state reforms of health and education.
Thank you. To what extent was the Thatcher government unsuccessful in moving in a free market direction?
Well, the main unfinished business really has been the welfare state part. There was a success in bringing forward opting out, and that seems to be going quite well also in the hospital area, there was also a success in the reforms of the benefit system, where a very large area of welfare spending on unemployment benefits and other benefits for the poor and so forth in work, where to some degree rationalized and made, instead of being unconditional handouts, they were made more conditional on being willing to take a job, the so-called restart program, and also on the conditions for receiving work receiving benefits if you were in work were tightened up and made more dependent on need. Now these programs are still, I think, unfinished. These programs of reform. We obviously have got a lot of unemployment still. A lot of that's due to the recession, but some of it is due to the fact that those programs are not working properly. Education and health are both half complete because they're free. And if you make public services completely free at the point of delivery, they're very hard to control the spending programs on them. So that both in the area of spending on benefits and in the area of spending on health and education, the programs are only half completed. And what needs to be done is to get most people who can afford to pay for things, to pay for health and education, and to help only those in need. What happens is that if you make these programs of health and education free at the point of delivery, the middle class people who can pay for them anyway will pay through higher taxation. Higher taxation's bad for incentives. Much better to get them to pay for what they get and really just help the people in need. And as far as sort of general benefits are concerned, they ought to be not universal. They ought to be, there is this phrase of privatizing welfare payments, privatizing benefits. And what it means is trying to make benefits available through charities, for example, which will very closely monitor whether those getting the benefits really need them. Otherwise, if you just have general universal handouts, however closely you try and monitor them, you'll fail because people will satisfy the criteria and they'll take the benefits. What you really need to do is to make benefits explicitly dependent on need and carefully monitored by experts such as sort of charity experts, who are skilled at giving benefits to people that need them, and then seeing them when they don't need them, they're withdrawn, and so that they can conserve cash for really important relief of hardship. So point number one, we've got to make the middle classes pay for health and education rather than pay through taxation, pay charges so that there's a proper rational market in health and education. And secondly, we've got to make the welfare system of benefits privatized so that it's properly economized and doesn't undermine incentives, because people can get these benefits, as it were, too easily and without proper careful screening of need.
Thank you. What policies would you like to see implemented by the government today to move towards a free market economy?
Well, if I build on the idea that we should make the welfare state work better by getting the middle classes to pay for health and education normally, and reserving help for those that are really in need, and then privatizing welfare so that that is also made much more selective and much more orientated towards those in need, then I think the corollary of that would be that we would get public spending under control. As we brought public spending under control, we would be able to cut taxes. And so the end of all this process would be that we would be able to cut taxes. As we cut taxes, we would be able to also bring down the top tax rates and go for a low standard rate of tax, as broad and as low as possible. Now, I would like to see the percentage of public spending in the UK, which is over 40% of national income at the moment. It's better than in many countries, but in Sweden, for example, it's nearly 60%. But they've finally cottoned on to the fact they've got to get it down, and are making some efforts to do that. But 40% is still too high, and we should try to bring it down to 30% and below. That would mean we could bring our tax rates down, and we could improve the general workings of the economy, increase people's freedom to spend their own money, and give them greater control over their lives.
Thank you. What are the main problems facing the British and world economies today, and what measures are necessary to recover from it?
Well, I've been talking about measures of free market reform. But one's got to remember that side by side with these free market reforms, we have to have a properly operating environment which is reasonably stable. Because if you have an economy that's constantly veering from boom to bust and has inflationary episodes followed by terrible deflation, you're going to not only damage the economy, you're also going to damage the political momentum for freedom. Because obviously people are going to say, well, capitalism, boom and bust, let's have intervention, and so on and so forth. So it's very important to also have a stable economy. And that's the major problem that we face at the moment, apart from the ongoing need to proceed with those reforms, which is something that has been rather slowed down at the moment under Mr. Major's government, but I'm hopeful we'll get back to doing them. But we also need a stable economy. And the biggest problem we have in Britain at the moment is membership of the exchange rate mechanism, because what that's done, first in the phase when we shadowed the Deutschmark in 1988, and now since 1990 in the formal phase of being members, is it first of all, it's given us a terrible boom and bust. It's aggravated the business cycle. And we have got to get away from that instability of the exchange rate mechanism and get back to a rational monetary policy where we run the economy in a stable way by targeting money supply as under monetarism, letting the exchange rate be flexible, and allowing interest rates to move flexibly too, so that we can lean against recessions and stop booms developing. And that would bring us back to a more stable economy, rather like the economy that we had in the mid-80s, which was much more stable than we'd had for a long time. And so I would say that's the major problem we face in the UK, controlling, getting a stable economic environment by getting back to monetarism. And in the world economy, most countries are in fact pursuing monetarist policies, and so the major problem that we face is really simply that we've got to pursue those monetarist policies systematically, and that should see the recovery resuming in the United States and in Japan. We've had some problems with that, but basically those policies are those monetarist policies are in place in most of those countries, and they don't face, although the recovery is being slow in the United States and slow in Japan, and there has been some instability. It hasn't been an instability on the scale that we've faced here with the exchange rate mechanism.
Shall I just answer that? Because unfortunately I'm a bit worried of the sound.
Yes. We basically covered it, haven't we?
Yeah, that's the
last one.
Actually, if you feel we finished there, then that's the last question.
Oh, was it? Oh, great. Okay,
I think
then.
that's about it.
Fine,
Let me
yeah.
just take a shot of the telephone if you can hear it. Like you do.
Oh, yeah, that's an idea.
Yeah,
Yes,
I mean, it's just part of that. What are the main problems facing the British and world economies today, and what measures are necessary to recover from it?
Well, the main problem facing the UK economy is membership of the exchange rate mechanism, which has aggravated very seriously the boom and bust of this particular capitalist economy. And you can't avoid business cycles, of course, but you can, by having stable monetarist policies which target the money supply to grow at a certain reasonably stable rate, and so you cut your interest rates in the recession, and of course you raise your interest rates in the boom to lean against the business cycle and stabilize the economy. And also, of course, the exchange rate moves around according to whatever shocks hit the economy, and so enable our exporters to continue to sell in world markets, essentially. Now, under the exchange rate mechanism, we've fixed ourselves to the Deutschmark, and we did it informally in early 1988, and we cut interest rates at that time, and badly worsened the very strong inflationary pressures of the boom in 1988. In 1990, we formally joined the exchange rate mechanism, and at a time when we were having quite a serious recession, we kept interest rates up to protect the pound this time, and that aggravated the bust. We had a terrible recession, which is still with us. And I think the key element for the UK economy is to get away from the instability of the exchange rate mechanism back to the stability of monetarism. And we did get a lot of stability in the economy in the mid-80s when we had the monetarist policies going. As far as the world economy is concerned, they are pursuing, on the whole, sensible monetarist policies. They are the major countries, the US, Japan, Germany, are all pursuing those sort of policies. They've made some mistakes and we have a bit of a recession on our hands, but the chances are that because they're pursuing those sorts of policies, the recovery will in due course proceed, and I'm reasonably optimistic that in those other economies, although we have a moderately bad recession at the moment, we will see some recovery naturally occur. My biggest worry is about the UK economy and the rest of Europe tied to the Deutschmark, countries like France and Italy and Spain, where the way in which the exchange rate mechanism works could aggravate recession quite badly and make it very difficult for those economies to pick up, not least, most of all, our economy. And so I think the most important problem facing the world economy at the moment is getting away from this very unstable exchange rate mechanism arrangement back to floating exchange rates and monetarist policies in all the major economies of Europe.
Great. Thanks very much. Great.
All right?
Yes, I think we're ready to roll.
Caps lock.